All right, guys, welcome back. Today is our last lecture for Unit 2, Foundations of Modern Nations. We've been studying this topic for a very long time. We've gone all the way from India through Africa, taking a look at Yugoslavia, and today we are going to end it by taking a look at the biggest and most powerful of all the new nations that we have talked about, and that is Russia. To remind you back of the history between the United States and Russia, a long history. Of course, the country of Russia went communist in the early 1900s with the revolutions that took place during World War I, and then found themselves to be really the main antagonist of the United States in that Cold War period. We teamed up to fight Hitler in World War II, but even by the end of World War II, we knew that the Russians were going to be the next conflict for the United States, and we started taking pretty strict action against them. Now, over the next 60 years, for the most part, we would go back and forth, and at points we became very bitter enemies to the point where nuclear war seemed very likely. I mean, the closest we got, the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, we came literally within minutes and hours of a full nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. Fast forward to 1991. In the 70s and 80s, the Soviet Union was going through a lot of transition. They're such a closed-off society that they were having some major economic problems behind the scenes, but not really, that wasn't being demonstrated outwardly. We're going to see here in the late 80s and the early 90s, and we've covered this a little bit with Yugoslavia, but a lot of their empire started to disintegrate, and a lot of those nations, especially in Eastern Europe, began to break away and declare their independence starting in the late 80s up through the early 90s, and they started to lose that grip on Eastern Europe. And I want to remind you, this is not ancient history. I think this is perhaps the most fascinating lecture out of all of the lectures we've given for this unit, because this is happening really now, and you want to understand a lot of the actions that are taking place by Russia, both domestically and internationally. A lot of the things they're doing is you got to back up and understand, what problems are they trying to solve. In a lot of ways, they're trying to gain control of what had been their empire, what had been a lot of their territory, or at least minimize the U.S.'s role there. So I understand that here we are in 2020, and to talk about Russia in any kind of political, realm can be somewhat controversial, which it really shouldn't be. I mean, there's a lot of facts out there that we can base this off of, and I hope that everything I'm giving you is factual. I've tried to research this thoroughly and giving you my best take on it. Don't be confused by all the loud noise out there. The current state of the world, we can't figure out what's going on by looking at facts, and that's what I plan to do here today. So I've titled this lecture Cold War 2.0, and we are going to be taking a look at the actions of Russia since the collapse of communism in 1991. We're going to take a look at their renewed rivalry with the United States, with the rise of Vladimir Putin. We're going to take a look at some of the actions that they've taken, how their foreign policy has really changed. And, before they used to roll tanks into places like Hungary to put down political revolts, or to try and shake nations up and, overturn leadership. They don't have to do that anymore. Today, it is mainly information-based, and we're going to see how they've done this successfully in multiple nations. First and foremost in the Ukraine, and we're going to see a revolution that took place there that was preceded by weeks of propaganda, of fake news that had been pushed into Ukraine that really allowed them to kind of come in and really just take over part of that nation. So let me get the lecture pulled up here. Just hang with me one second. And there we go. So again, Cold War 2.0, here we go. We're not really going to get in much to the actions that took place right there at the what brought about the end of the Cold War. Hopefully you've studied that in your American history classes, but it was not a smooth transition for the former Soviet Union becoming the Russian Federation, moving from, they became exact opposites. You move from a very totalitarian Soviet-style system, authoritarian, where you have these leaders that make all the decisions for the country, to all of a sudden now, now you are introducing things like democracy and capitalism, and really no one had dealt with either of those things. And sadly, there were some pretty critical errors that were made in the first few years that really doomed democracy in Russia. And you can't discount the long history of corruption in that nation that did not just go away because the sickle and hammer lowered from the flagpole for the last time. So this is really a look at how Russia is transitioning from a communist nation, and how failure of democracy and the introduction of capitalism really changed everything. All right, so I want to look right away at the economics. Again, you cannot go from, you cannot go any more different from moving from communism to capitalism. Those kind of changes overnight are very, very difficult to make. And especially when you think about, in a communist society, all of the nation's industries and all of the nation, I mean, you've gone from where privatization and personal ownership is illegal to now all of a sudden putting everything in the hands of private ownership. So how do you actually do that? Well, what they decided to do was what was called a voucher privatization program. And they basically divided up these industries, the oil industries, utilities, all these different things. And they created vouchers that each citizen would get. And, these vouchers were worth a certain, percentage of these companies. Russia is a very poor nation. And, especially for many people in the rural areas that might be struggling just to simply put food on the table, a voucher does not do that for them. All right. It's a piece of paper. So what ends up happening in the early 90s is that after the vouchers were distributed and trying to distribute the ownership of these industries, they basically began to be collected by very few individuals. And they're buying these vouchers up for next to nothing. And now all of a sudden, what we're finding is that very, very few people now control basically all of the major industries in Russia. This is what has left the majority of Russians kind of behind in terms of economically, but it has propped up a very, very small group that we call oligarchs. Oligarch is not a new term. Ancient Greece had oligarchs, but where you have kind of the rule of the few, the wealthy, and that is what has occurred here. So during privatization, you basically had these small groups of people, mainly men, that were able to control a lot of these vouchers and ended up gaining control of the entire country's major industries. That stat there at the bottom, 70% of all Russian finances will be controlled by 7 individuals by 2000. 70% of all the money in Russia controlled by 7 people. This was a completely horrible, horribly instituted program that, really would not only lead to future corruption, but it also doomed democracy too in that country, because we've seen the impact that money has had in our elections and how it's able to sway people's opinions. Over in Russia, where you do have more corruption and you do have more bribery, now all of a sudden you have these ultra wealthy individuals that are in full control of all of Russia's finances, and they're going to be pulling a lot of strings, especially when they get people in positions of power, like we will see later on, such as Vladimir Putin. So the rise of the Russian oligarchs in the 90s, they really positioned themselves in a great spot to control vast amounts of wealth and really doom democracy in Russia. Let's talk about the politics of modern day Russia. I think it is fair to say that Russia is a failed democracy. They do have elections, but as we've seen even recently in the news, Vladimir Putin is more than willing to change the constitution in order to allow him to remain in power. And often he gets very, very high. I mean, over here, you are lucky to get maybe 60% of the vote, right? That is not the case in Russia. I mean, a lot of times they're having elections and it's 80, 90%. So, there's a lot of corruption that goes on at all levels of Russian politics, and it's very sad to see. Also, to not to get too violent with this, but frankly, violence is a major part of this as well. Those that are reporting corruption, those that are reporting these major issues often go missing. There have been a number of journalists that have been killed because of speaking out against the government, very critical of the government. I cannot emphasize enough, and I know we've gotten to this point in our country where a lot of people see the media as the enemy. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the freedom of the press, to be able to report the news, to be able to have access to our top leadership. Because take Russia, for example. I mean, you have a country here who, I mean, if you are not towing the party line, if you are not doing what Vladimir Putin wants, you not just, I mean, will be fired, but I mean, you are very well putting yourself in a position to be killed. There's no place like this there's no place for this in a democracy. And so one of the main reasons that I do say that Russia is a failed democracy, and it's not just journalists, opposition leaders, moderate leaders, we find that they are often arrested, tortured, killed, assassinated. We're going to see Russia do this to one of the presidents in Ukraine. They're going to attempt to assassinate him. So, sadly, politics, democracy has not really taken root. And part of it is because they lack many of the freedoms that we do, the freedom of the press in particular. So it's very important that, again, that journalists have access to the government and are able to criticize without fearing violence or repercussion. All right, moving on to the main man here, and that is Vladimir Putin. Putin took over as president in 2000. He has, for the most part, served in that role ever since. There was a short, I don't even have it in my notes, or actually, I'm sorry, I do. From 2008 to 2012, he served as prime minister. And I think this might have even been a new position that had been created for him, because they did have term limits on presidents, just like we did. And Putin was running to the end of his term, and was able to successfully put himself in a major position of power, to where he basically handpicked the successor and was kind of pulling strings behind the scenes. He was always in power, and then has taken over since 2012, once again, as president of Russia. His background, he is a former KGB officer, okay? Go back to the Cold War, our version of the CIA. So imagine, our spies that are gathering intelligence across the world. That was Vladimir Putin's role for Russia during the communist period. In fact, I believe he was working in Germany at the time. I think Eastern Germany. I could be off on that, but he did. He was an officer for the KGB. That was his first kind of diving into politics there. He would eventually become the head of the KGB's successor organization, which is called the FSB. So again, this guy is, frankly, he's dangerous. And this guy is an example of, during that Soviet style system. And I don't know that he necessarily, agreed with communism, but the authoritarian side of things, he is trying to replicate that in modern day Russia. So we are really dealing with basically a kind of a Soviet spy, in a former Soviet spy, as the president of Russia at this time. He would really get into high-level politics when Boris Yeltsin, who's really the first president of Russia, he would become the chief of staff under Yeltsin. And Yeltsin had a lot of issues dealing with, a lot of personal issues that he dealt with. And Vladimir Putin was right there behind the scenes, once again, pulling strings, as you can imagine. The corruption side of this, Putin has had people killed, assassinated, and he has stopped free elections from taking place. We're going to talk about one of those elections in Crimea here soon. Freedom of the press has been under attack. We know that dissidents have been jailed and executed for speaking out against Putin. We know artists have been persecuted for depictions of Putin that are not positive. A lot of human rights abuses. Let me see if I can move this. Hopefully that moves your window for me. The popularity of Putin. He does remain fairly popular. And I mentioned the high success rates he's had in elections, and I do believe there's a lot of corruption behind that. But Putin is very successful. I mean, he has taken this fledgling nation that frankly was kind of a laughing stock under Yeltsin, and he has returned them to a position of power. Now, he has done so with an iron fist, and again, at the expense of democracy itself in Russia. But he has returned Russia to a very powerful position. And, for Russians that really haven't known, any of the benefits of democracy or capitalism, they're willing to return back to this authoritarian style system, especially, with the, conflict between, the United States over the last few years. We've seen that, Russia's stock, especially in parts of the world like Eastern Europe, have risen. He successfully was able to take over part of a nation, and the world did nothing. There's a lot of negatives, but frankly, and sadly, I think for many Russians, some of the popularity comes from what are global negatives has made Russia more powerful. So he's definitely a very powerful figure. Now, it is interesting to take a look at some of the Russian military engagements, and I'm kind of working my way up to Ukraine and some of the modern engagements. But if you go back to the 1990s, Russia has had, and this goes well back before that, but some of the major wars with, in particular, one of their southern regions called Chechnya. And again, ethnic divisions have caused many of the issues here. You can see Chechnya primarily is Muslim population, and you have, the majority of Russians are Orthodox Christians. So there's some cultural differences between these two areas. And what we've seen is numerous wars and terrorist incidents taking place between these two regions. The first major war between these two regions was the First Chechen War, which took place from 1991 to 1996, and this was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Chechnya decided that they, alongside pretty much the rest of Europe, would Eastern Europe, I should mention, that this was the time for them to declare independence. And so they attempted it, but Russia intervened and said that, no, you're not going to be leaving us anytime soon. So they invaded, and you can see there the fighting lasted for 2 years. Approximately 30,000 people died on the military side, civilians. The Russians were extremely brutal with the bombing campaigns in Chechnya. And so 80,000 civilians died there in this war. The Second Chechen War lasted for about 10 years, lasting from the late 90s all the way through the early 2000s. And Chechnya kind of sparked this one. You had a jihad declared, and we'll talk more about jihads in our next unit, the Middle East. What we see here is Chechnya has taken action, which the Russians felt like they needed to intervene to stop. And the Russians will take, for the most part, they will take control of the land, but the insurgency is what lasts a long time. 80,000 people killed in this. And in the middle of this Second Chechen War, you did have one of the worst terrorist attacks in Russian history. And that was when some Chechen rebels took hold of a theater in Moscow and demanding action in Chechnya to cease. Before somewhat botched rescue, 117 people were killed in that attack. I vividly remember that attack taking place. I mean, just absolutely horrible. Of course, innocent people being caught up in that. So these actions. This is not ancient history for sure. I mean, these are modern issues, modern times. All right, so let me find a good place for the window here. Okay, so let's talk about the action that's been taking place in Ukraine over the last half decade. Excuse me. So Ukraine used to be a part of the Russian Empire, and this was one of those nations that collapsed, broke away in 1991 and became independent. Now, fast forward to 2014, and you have the start of the major issues. So, a lot of these Eastern European countries have started to have started to try and kind of push more closely to the West. They've wanted to be closer to the West in terms of the economy, wanting to join the European Union, and kind of separating themselves out from Russia. Not aligning as much with Russia, wanting to seek Western alliances. Well, Ukraine became heavily split over this because the Ukrainian government wanted to align closer with Russia. But many of the people, especially in the central and western part of the country, most of the people wanted to join the EU. Okay, so to push away from Russia. And so this began as protests because the president of Ukraine, he wanted closer ties with Russia and actually signed a number of agreements that, although people are in the streets demonstrating to join the EU, he's signing agreements with Russia. And basically all hell kind of broke loose in 2014. I'd like to draw your attention to the picture in the lower left there. That is one of the city centers in Ukraine. And it became kind of a rallying point for the pro-West people of Ukraine. You have a split shot here if you haven't figured it out yet. On the western side, you have what the city looked like before the war, the civil war began. And on the eastern side, you can see the conflict and how much damage was caused in this area. I want to remind you, I've had friends that have gone to Ukraine and have thoroughly enjoyed it. Beautiful country. I want to remind you just how fragile society is, and perhaps it's ironic me saying this, recording this lecture in my basement because of a global pandemic happening. But hopefully by now we're starting to realize how fragile our nations truly are in terms of political peace and social harmony. Nowhere is perfect, but whatever we can do to avoid scenes like this from unfolding, we need to take part in that. So this whole time Russia is trying to get Russia is basically kind of trying to get the Ukrainians on their side, and they already have the government on their side. But once they realize that they are not going to be able to control all of Russia, the Russians actually have a pretty bold maneuver. In fact, I want to go back here because I did not point it out. If you look at the bottom of the map on the right-hand side, you'll see a little peninsula in the bottom of Ukraine called Crimea. Crimea is a beautiful area, and you can see it sits there. I believe that's the Black Sea that it sits upon, but a beautiful area. The population in Crimea is primarily made up of Russian-speaking, either Ukrainians or Russians themselves. But it has been a part of Ukraine for really 100 years. I think actually it was gifted to, at the time, Russia by the nation of Turkey. So, when Ukraine became, its own separate nation in the Cold War, they kept Crimea. And so basically what's going to happen here is Russia is going to take advantage of the civil war that is happening in Ukraine, and they are going to invade Crimea. Now, how they do this is pretty shocking. This is modern age, right? This is less than 10 years ago. Look at the pictures I have below. These are Russian special operations soldiers who were used to invade Crimea. Notice that they have no emblems on them. They have no names. They have no flags representing what country they come from. These were little green men dressed up that basically took hold of that peninsula in Crimea. Now, the reason that they went in, that's where we kind of get into some of the interesting parts here. So let me move my window here. Why they felt like they could invade Crimea at this time. So propaganda has always been a part of war, of course. And what we started to see is a few months before the invasion of Crimea, Russian television outlets, in particular, they have a station that runs out of Moscow. It is actually, you can find it even here in the United States. It's called RT. Sometimes I'll see people, retweet articles about, from RT. That stands for Russia Today. That is a Kremlin-based news organization, and responsible for a lot of propaganda that gets put out there. Well, they, in the months preceding the invasion of Crimea, they began to give, frankly, false reports. They just made up reports of Ukrainians attacking Russians in Crimea. It had not happened. But yet those people that are in Crimea are listening to the news. And again, you don't have any reason to necessarily doubt it. And so, they begin believing that they may be, they may be threatened by Ukraine. And you can see there in the upper left-hand corner, there were actually studies done that showed in the months preceding the invasion of Crimea what the news talked about, what Russia Today actually talked about before this invasion took place. And you'll notice the horrors of life. They're making people in the Ukraine afraid to leave their homes. Protests, chaos, seeing chaos. They're pushing this idea that Europe is on the decay, which is completely false. Terrorism, this chaos is leading to more terrorism and will allow more refugees to take hold. So they're using fear, and that is such a huge lesson I want to get across to you, is that propaganda almost always uses fear to try and get people to change their actions. And so they're doing all of this preceding what's called a referendum, where people are allowed to vote on if they want to take action on this. Well, 97%, according to the results of this election, 97% of Crimean voters voted to join the Russian Federation, basically meaning that they would leave Ukraine and they would join Russia. Right after these, 97%, guys, think about it. I mean, most of our elections are decided like 55% to 45%. Like, most people are so split on big issues like this that 97%. I mean, that is blaring that there's corruption involved in this. And of course, the international community, including the United States, called Russia out on this, saying that this election was illegal. Also pointing out the fact that Russia had already invaded Crimea. So people are actually going out to vote, if they did, passing Russian soldiers in the streets, perhaps. And so, this election was completely false. But Russia used this as, they're propping up the fact that they like to think of themselves as a democratic society, and, they're pushing out this vote. Oh, look, 97%. Trust me, it is not. It was fraudulent from the very beginning, and it was just used to prop up an illegal invasion. Today, the Ukrainian nation and Russia are still fighting along these border areas, and we'll get into it just here in a second, but, in particular with the conversation that was had between the Ukrainian president, President Trump, that's why this is such a big deal, because the threat or the removal of aid to Ukraine, well, we're their number one ally in this fight against Russia. Okay, so, this is all starting to, I hope, kind of, come to your memory here, because this has been in the news fairly recently. All right. Well, let's talk about the way that Russia has been able to use this propaganda machine, and really I won't say inventors of fake news, but they have definitely figured out that by pushing out fake stories, just like we saw in Ukraine, that they are able to push out disinformation campaigns that have real effects. They no longer have to roll tanks through the streets to get people to believe what they want. Now they can do it by pushing out, minimum wage workers, that have fake Twitter profiles. It's a crazy change in how they are taking control of different parts of the world. But as we've seen in Ukraine, it's successful. It works. So, I know this area is, more modern, and we're kind of in this right now. So, I really will try to stay as politically neutral on this as possible and just talk about the facts here. But the fact is that we know 100%, and both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, do believe that Russia has a full campaign to try and push an agenda throughout the world, using both traditional outlets and that is like media, like television, like we just talked about Russia Today. Um, they also have radio stations that they push out throughout the rest of the world, and also social media. We'll talk about that on the next slide, but we know that there are hundreds of thousands of I call them fake, but they have a very real person sitting behind the computer screen. Facebook profiles, Twitter profiles. They put up videos on YouTube, and again, a lot of them are conspiracy. A lot of them have no actual factual basis behind them, but they try and get people to believe a certain narrative. And in a lot of areas, they've been successful with that. Before I leave this slide, I want to point out, one of those traditional outlets that the Russians have been using is radio. For those that are watching that aren't a part of this class, we're based out of Kansas City, Missouri. They actually just started broadcasting this year, Radio Sputnik, which again, I mean, they get their funding from the Kremlin. I am all for freedom of speech and freedom of press, but we have to be careful because this is literally a Russian based propaganda outlet that you can turn on your radio and listen to. So, it's here. It is here around us. And I should mention that they only have 2 radio stations, Kansas City being one and Washington, D.C. Being the other. And for our final slide here, we'll take a look. You got to mention the 2016 elections. With that Russian disinformation campaign, we know that they were pushing out fake stories. I mean, this is not debatable because Russians have been pushing out this fake stuff. Now, we can debate how much influence it's actually had. That's very much debatable. But we know for a fact the government, our intelligence services, Facebook, Twitter themselves, we know that they are pushing out this kind of information. Twitter reporting that 36,000 Russian bots were being used, so fake profiles that were basically retweeting the same message. So it looked, it got 1,000 retweets. Well, 900 of those are these Russian bots. So that's how they get exposure to these ideas. But Facebook reported that 126 million users were exposed to Russian disinformation in 2016, the year of our presidential election. 126 million. That's just that's a little under half of every American in this country that was exposed to some kind of story that the Russians had come up with. So this is regardless of who they're supporting, why they're supporting whomever, do not believe for a second that the Cold War has really come to an end. Do not believe for a second that the Russians, don't pose as much of a danger today as they have throughout practically all of our history. They are trying to influence every nation on this earth, and it's much cheaper. It is much cheaper to hire a bunch of, again, minimum wage tech nerds to run Russian bots, all day long than it is to fight a war, right? A traditional war. So they know this is a cheaper way to get what they want done. And while they're relaxing in their in their yachts in Ukraine, take that for example. The last point there, the global disinformation campaign. The United States is not the only one that has had to deal with this. We have seen elections that have been swayed in Africa, France, Spain, again, Ukraine. We even saw that, again, that Russian-Ukrainian war that has been going on for since 2014. There was one sad side effect, and you might remember this, but there was a Malaysia Flight 17 that was shot down over Ukraine, and immediately the Russian Twitter sphere took to the story that it had been the rebels that had shot down this plane. We now know that it was most likely the Russians, not doing it on purpose, that it was actually an accident, but we now know that the Russians were responsible for shooting down that plane. But we can study now how quickly that propaganda machine went into effect to try and prove to the world that it in fact was not the Russian military, that it was somebody else. So this is a very real threat, not only for the United States, but for the entire world. And, I feel like there's a lot of chaos in regards to what news you can trust now. And you want to understand where a lot of that has come from. It is right here, people. So, I hope it gets better, but it does prove how important it is to, not just spread things. It's so easy to spread things with the click of a button. Read it over. Does it come from, a source that you actually really do trust? Is it something that, not only reputable, but is it something that can be found in other, reputable sources? So, keep all of that in mind. And because there's a lot of people out there that are trying to sway your opinion and trying to get you to think differently, and do some research before you start spreading things. So, all right, guys. Well, that will do it for me today. This will wrap up our unit on foundations of modern nations. I hope you guys have enjoyed the unit. I'm sorry it had to be in this format. I know watching lectures on YouTube is not the most fun way to do this thing. But for those in class, understand that now that we've reached the end of the unit, there will be a unit test coming up soon, and I will be sure to share more information with you guys soon regarding what that test will look like. Thanks a lot, and leave a comment below if you have any questions.